The Post-Impressionism period was between 1885 and 1910. It was a soft revolt against Impressionism. Post-Impressionism uses unrealistic colors to depict the subject matter, while Impressionism involved using realistic colors to depict the subject matter. Typically, Post-Impressionism was based on the emotion and concept of the artist, while Impressionism captured the heat of the subject. The Belle Epoque era, or Beautiful Era, was started in late 19th century France after the Franco-Prussian War and continued until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. The Belle Epoque era was characterized by peace and wealth as well as technological, scientific, and cultural innovation. It flourished in Paris and was the start of the Post-Impressionist movement. Vincent van Gogh was a Dutch post-impressionist painter. Throughout his life, he struggled both financially and emotionally. Van Gogh was always attracted to troubled women, therefore he was surrounded by terrible incidents involving them, and this greatly influenced his work. His most well-known piece of art being Starry Night, which was painted by memory. Van Gogh's art was aimed at articulating the spirituality of man and nature. He did this through a mix of styles that enabled him to create art that could portray far more than a mere appearance of the subject. Paul Gauguin was a French artist that was intentionally schooled in Impressionism, but broke away from its fascination with the everyday world to start a new style of painting referred to as symbolism. In the late 1800s, as the Impressionist movement was accumulating, Gauguin experimented with new color theories and semi-decorative approaches to painting. Gauguin worked with Van Gogh one summer in South France before turning his back on Western society. He abandoned his life as a stockbroker and began traveling to the South Pacific in the early 1890s. Paul Cézanne was the prominent French artist of the Post-Impressionist era. He is credited with trailblazing modernism, both virtually and conceptually. He was financially secure on account of his father's prosperous position as a co-founder of a banking firm. Cézanne worked in Paris for some time and became acquainted with many of the other influential artists of the era. However, after adopting a more impressionist style, he began to work in isolation. His work most accurately represents the link between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, as well as Fauvism and Expressionism. Georges Seurat is primarily remembered as the pioneer of the neo-impressionist technique commonly known as pointillism. His innovations derive from new scientific theories about color and expression, yet the graceful beauty of his work is explained by the influence of very different sources. He believed that great modern art would show contemporary life in ways similar to classical art, except that it would use technologically informed techniques. Later he grew more interested in Gothic art and popular posters, and the influence of these on his work make it some of the first modern art to make use of such uncontroversial sources for expression. The Russo-Japanese War heavily influenced art during the beginning of the 20th century. Many artists went off to war zones to create art inspired by the clash of cultures that the Russo-Japanese War represented. Much of the art made was in favor of Russia because Russia was considered European, and an overwhelming amount of artists were European. The result of the Japan-Russo War symbolized a shift in power where the East could still defeat the West. This new view of the East for the West gave many scholars and artists a new, more international perspective. The German artists were the first to feel the impact of World War I's tragedies firsthand. They returned to civilization life determined to channel their collective trauma into new forms of expression. Some sought refuge in abstraction. Fauvism was the first of the avant-garde movements that flourished in France in the early years of the 20th century. The Fauvist painters were the first to break with Impressionism as well as with older, traditional methods of perception. Their spontaneous, often subjective response to nature was expressed in bold, undistinguished brushstrokes and high-keyed, vibrant colors directly from the tube. Expressionism was a modernist movement. It is typically aimed at presenting the world solely from a subjective perspective, distorting it radically for emotional effects in order to evoke moods or ideas. During the Boxer Rebellion in China, the Boxers wanted to revert back to the times of the Golden Days, where Chinese brothers and sisters were full Chinese left untainted and would rally up to fight with their own kind, where martial arts was the best defense and not firearms, where farming and agriculture defined the economics of China and not industries of heavy metal smithing. All in all, a time when the East never met the West. They consisted mostly of the peasant class. Henri Matisse was one of the most influential artists of the century. His stylistic innovations fundamentally altered the course of modern art. His vast set of skills, including painting, drawing, sculpture, graphic arts, paper cutouts, and book illustrations. His varied subjects comprised of landscape, still life, portraiture, domestic and studio interiors, and particularly focused on the female figure. He was more concerned with the free color, which allowed for expression in his work. Ernest Ludwig Kirchner was a German expressionist painter and printmaker. Fauvism was particularly significant in directing his palette, encouraging him to use flat areas of unbroken, often unmixed color in simplified forms. In 1933, his work was branded as degenerate by Nazis. In 1937, over 600 of his works were sold or destroyed. On June 15, 1938, he committed suicide by gunshot. In his early years, Kandinsky pursued an academic law career in Russia. He later abandoned this path and moved to Munich in 1896 at the age of 30 to study art. Kandinsky rejected objective representation and materialism, instead favoring a spiritual approach of inner necessity, which culminated his breakthrough in abstraction. At the outbreak of World War I, he was expelled from Germany due to being a Russian citizen. His paintings began to increasingly adopt a geometric style. Early on in his career, Franz Marc gave up studying theology and philosophy for painting. Marc's main artistic theme was animals, which he considered as uncorrupted symbols of spiritual renewal. Marc also rejected any naturalistic use of color and sought comic unity of figure, landscape, matter, and spirit. He also eventually applied lessons of cubist fracturing of space to his art style. In August 1914, he volunteered for the war and was immediately sent to the front. On March 1916, he was killed in action at the age of 36. Marc and Kandinsky met in December 1910, and only a year later they formed the Blau Reiter, or Blue Rider. The Blau Riders were a loose association of painters who shared an interest in abstracted forms and prismatic colors, which they felt had spiritual values that could counteract the corruption and materialism of their age. The flattened perspective and reductive forms of woodcut helped put the artist on the path towards abstraction. Post-Impressionism was an art style that is supposed to depict a subject. It uses bright and unrealistic colors as well as small strokes to create softer images. The Post-Impressionism period led to Fauvism and Expressionism. Fauvism uses pointillism to create a subject. Expressionism doesn't focus on a subject, however has one object as the subject and everything else is distorted in order to create a desired emotional effect.